Hi, I'm Mandy Medley, and I'm one of the workers and co-owners at Pilsen Community Books, and I'm so excited to welcome you here tonight for a celebration of Mark Nowak's newest book, Social Poetics. And I'm really excited to also welcome Daniel Borzutzky and Tara Betts. It's really an all-star reading tonight. I'm, of course, a huge fan of all the work that Coffee House Press publishes, and Social Poetics is no exception. But I'm particularly excited to host Mark tonight because his poetry, his politics, and his work with the Workers' Writers' School has special significance to me as a reader, as a poet, as a worker, and as a socialist. And the way Mark's work expands what literature is, what it can do, and who it belongs to, or as our buddy Marx would say, redistributes literature back to the people, is at the forefront of the movement to fight for a better world. And it's no exaggeration to say that Mark's one of my biggest heroes. So thanks for joining us here tonight, Mark.
Thank you.
A few words about Pilsen Community Books. PCB is a used and new independent bookstore in the beloved Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, and it was established in 2016. And in March of this year, PCB transitioned into a worker cooperative staffed by career booksellers with a combined 50-plus years of bookselling experience. We host events that unapologetically sit at the intersection of literature and politics. And Mark's launch for Social Poetics was supposed to be our first in-person event as a worker cooperative and didn't happen for reasons in the larger world. So I'm so excited that we could reschedule it tonight, and I look forward to the day when we'll all be in person together again. A few notes about how this evening will go. I'm going to turn over the metaphorical mic to Daniel in a few moments, and then he, Tara, and Mark will discuss both Social Poetics and their own respective projects. And at the end, we'll have time for a Q&A, so if you have any questions at all during the event, just pop them into the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce everyone. Tara Betts is the author of Break the Habit and Arc and Hue, and in addition to her work as the poetry editor at another Chicago magazine and the Langston Hughes Review, she is the lit editor at New City. She teaches a weekly poetry workshop at Stateville Maximum Security Prison, and she hosts author chats at the Seminary Co-op bookstores in Chicago and other literary events. And she lives in Chicago. Daniel Borzutzky is the author of Lake Michigan, which was a finalist for the 2019 Griffin International Poetry Prize, and The Performance of Being Human, which received the 2016 National Book Award. His other books include In the Murmurs of the Rotten Carcass Economy, Memories of My Overdevelopment, and The Book of Interfering Bodies. He teaches in the English and Latin American and Latino Studies departments at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And Mark Nowak is the author of Coal Mountain Elementary, Shut Up, Shut Down, Revenants, and of course, his newest book, Social Poetics, all out from Coffee House Press. He is the recipient of the Freedom Plow Award for Poetry and Activism and fellowships from the Lannan and Guggenheim Foundations. Nowak has led poetry workshops for workers and trade unions in the US, South Africa, the UK, Panama, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. He is currently a professor of English at Manhattanville College and the founding director of the Workers' Writers' School. And now, I'll turn it over to Daniel.
Hi, thank you, Mandy. I'm so excited to be here supporting Mark's tremendous, incredible achievement of a book, and I can't wait to ask him some questions about it. Thank you as well, Mandy, for hosting us, and it's great to be with Tara as well. Mark suggested very wisely that I say a few words about the significance of the date of September 11th for Chile, which is the country where my family comes from. We of course know about September 11th in the United States, but for those who don't know, September 11th is also a significant date in Chilean history, and as a result, global economic history as well. So on September 11th, 1973, the democratically elected socialist president of Chile, Salvador Allende, was overthrown by the military dictatorship that was supported by the US and led by Augusto Pinochet. That dictatorship ruled for 17 years, disappearing, killing thousands, tens of thousands of people, torturing many thousands, and leaving again tens of thousands of people to go into exile throughout the world. In addition to the brutal repression that the dictatorship created, it also created a brutal economic system, right? And I think this directly connects to much of the context for the work that Mark is doing, and for the workers in particular that he is making poetry with, right? So that brutal economic system was, of course, designed at the University of Chicago by the so-called Chicago boys, who believed that they needed some sort of disaster, to use Naomi Klein's language, in order to enact their economic policies, right? In this case, there needed to be a brutalized society who did not have the ability to speak for themselves, right? And so this became the testing ground for neoliberalism, or extreme capitalism, right? That in effect was then imported throughout the rest of the world and back to the United States as well, right? So features of that brutal capitalism include the destruction of labor unions, the privatization of the public sector, including energy, water, and these things remain in Chile today under privatization, right? And really, I think a shift in the public's thinking about what the role of government was meant to do, right? If there was a belief that government existed to help workers, to help provide services, right? This shifted the dynamic to a highly individualized one, in which the market was meant to be the thing that helped us, right? So to conclude, I mean, we see in Chile, for example, privatized Social Security, which was something that was attempted to bring here multiple times, right? And one of the results of such things is that people can't retire, right? They have to pay into private pension funds. The private pension funds make something like 25% or 30% commission on people's retirement payments, and they end up not being able to retire, which forms the context, of course, for much of what happened in Chile in fall of 2019 as well, where there was a renewed social protest, and really the first major protests to really try to bring down the economic system started by the dictatorship. So I will stop there and turn it over to Tara, but that provides a little bit of global context, in the sense that that moment in Chile was one that was then exported both throughout the Americas, to Europe, to Asia and Africa as well.
Okay. So I know I'm supposed to talk a little bit about Whirlwind Center. I would love to talk about the book, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. Okay. I am all for canines who don't believe in neoliberalism and privatization. So it sounded like the dog was chiming in at just the right time. But that's okay. I figured we could make light, It's like the dogs want to participate too. But I think one of the things that I found really compelling about social poetics, and why I've been wanting to do a project or rather an organization like Whirlwind Center for so long, is not just a dissatisfaction with what I saw happening in the academic industrial complex and in other organizations. It was also because I feel like those spaces that are outside the university are overlooked so much, in terms of how they innovate with language, in terms of the stories that are always left out, in terms of the people who are often considered not imaginative, the people who are not considered people who are innovators of how we look at creativity. And that's a huge falsehood. I feel like this book dismantles a lot of those falsehoods and pulls from the people that shaped me as a person. You know, like I remember one time, I'll say it's in one of my graduate school programs, someone actually said to me, because I had curated a reading series in the area where my graduate school program was, and I didn't do it on campus. I refused to do it on campus. And this particular person had said to me, said, they go, why would you do that? That's a waste. And I just was floored. I could not believe that when when I told them most of my education as a poet came before I ever went to graduate school. I went to public libraries. I went to open mics. I went to public readings in bookstores like Women and Children First, or very much like what Pilsen Community Books is doing now. So to me, those free public sites meant much more to me. And I could control how I took in that information and how people kind of talked to me in a certain way. So I could build my confidence as a writer. So I really want to applaud Mark for that. And also drawing attention. I want you to definitely talk about the opening chapter, Mark. I would love that. Because one of the things when I started to teach, I noticed was that I would look for craft books and books about pedagogy. And more often than not, you never see one written by a woman of color. You know, like one of the instrumental books for me was June Jordan's Poetry for the People, A Revolutionary Blueprint, which I can kind of see how your book is modeled after that method in some ways. But I was really excited to read about this anthology she did with Henry Holt in 1970 in the opening chapter, and one that Sonia Sanchez did in 1971, and how these American writers kind of segue into these other scenes and sites that you talk about in the book, including the whole Borders unionization group that you worked with. So if you want to talk a little bit about that just to start. I know that was a long lead in, but...
No, that's great. First of all, thank you, everybody. It's great to finally be able to do this. I wanted to do this so badly back in March and really kick off Pilsen Community Books with this event. But I'm glad to be here now. And hey, everybody out there watching, thank you for joining in. So Social Poetics really has kind of two parts, right? It has this part with the Worker Writer School, an organization that I started calling that maybe about a decade ago, but actually started doing the workshops maybe about 15 years ago in Chicago, actually, with Teamsters and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, with Bob Bruno, a labor historian at the University of Illinois at Chicago, offered a space to do it. And then in St. Paul at a closing Ford plant. And so I did these workshops and kind of document them in what's the, I don't know, second and half or more of the book. What I wanted to really try to do was to say not like that this was some unique phenomenon that I had started in a way, like poetry workshops in union centers and at the offices of Domestic Workers United or elsewhere, but that there really was a kind of a long undocumented history of this kind of work, right? And so I started calling it after Howard Zinn and E.P. Thompson, A People's History of the Poetry Workshop. And how did the poetry workshop function before the growth of the MFA industry, before its move into institutions in the academy? And why was it, as I kept looking, that every time there was a pretty serious upheaval in the United States or elsewhere around the world, as I do in the next chapter, somehow the poetry workshop was always there for people to write about their lived experiences, to analyze politics, to create new poems, right? And so it starts with the Watts Rebellion and the workshops in Watts. and the kind of political fissures in those workshops around race and the split of the poets from that group. As you mentioned, June Jordan's workshops with young people in New York City during the time of the New York City teachers' strike, the Attica prison uprising, and Celeste Tisdale's workshops from 72 to 74 at Attica prison, and then others, the Sandinistas, the South African anti-apartheid trade union workshops. There seem to always be these moments right on the heels of revolutions and uprisings when people wanted the poetry workshop as a vehicle to get together, to build solidarity, to reflect on struggle, it's a kind of political education and craft education that simultaneously happens in them at the same time between each other, between the teacher and student, but between everybody in that space. And so it was really important to me as I'd for a long time been working on the latter chapters of the book, but it was super important for me to try to place it into a history rather than saying it was some unique kind of workshop with workers, because it wasn't. All of those previous workshops were working class poetry workshops in the US and around the country.
Right. And I think it's really compelling too, because this could have been, I don't want to say heady or theoretical, because I think it does that in some really useful ways, but it's definitely a combination of almost like memoir, a pedagogical text, but also like some literary analysis, like some of the types of things they wrote in the class and sharing some of their poems, which I think could make it a very useful teaching tool in a lot of ways. But I'm also thinking about how it contributes to why we teach, right? And why is it important for everyone to be able to write? And I kept going back to that passage. I think it's on page 142. And you start talking about Rancière and Proletarian Nights and just that capacity to be able to sit and think and to dream. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm wondering, because I know when I've seen that as somebody facilitating a workshop or being present in a workshop, have you caught moments where the dream starts to slip in?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the dream slips in. And I think one of the best examples were the Worker Writing School then started after being in New York City and doing a year with Domestic Workers United, which was the group that organized for the first domestic worker Bill of Rights in the United States. It was signed by the previous governor, Governor Patterson. And then we did a year of workshops with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, who I talk about quite a bit in the book. Yeah. And then I was in upstate New York, and there's a really great group here, the Worker Justice Center of New York, that works predominantly with migrant farm workers who work all the fields here that supplies, basically all the food for New York City restaurants, et cetera. And we started a series of workshops during the winter season. And the book I chose was Pablo Neruda's Book of Questions, which would not be your his most straightforward political work in a way, right? But it's so inquisitive and interrogative and just circles around the asking of questions. And it's so kind of tightly crafted at the same time. It's just a beautiful book. And so that became the textbook for the workshops. And so we wrote for, 3 or 4 months. We would meet every other week at the Worker Justice Center. And then when we were talking about and so then that was a lot of ways in which the dream came in a way, and that dreaminess, but certainly, for migrant farm workers here and everywhere, the amount of work, the conditions of which one was working, the length of the days that one is working, it's almost impossible to find a space to do something like this, to create art, right? And so what we wanted to do at the end was to try to have the work that we did be sort of both a celebration and an intervention. So PEN America got who I have collaborated with, we're starting our 10th year together. They had gotten a permit to hold a poetry reading in Union Square in New York City for the farm workers. And they didn't mention it was just poetry reading for the Penn World Voices Festival. And when we got the permit, we brought farm workers down from Kingston, New York, a couple hours north of the city. And so the farm workers were actually able to read the poems they had written. Like, we turned over a milk crate and you step on top of the milk crate and read your poem. But it was often right in front of the food seller whose farm that they worked at, or that was like right around the turn, right around the corner from it. So it became a way, the farmers market is always, there are this bumper sticker, no farms, no food, that everybody's probably seen, but it's really no farm workers, no food, right? And we wanted to kind of call attention to that, to that plight. And the poems were, because we had been reading Neruda, some of them, one of them that I reproduced in the book is a really very sad poem, right, about a worker coming to the Utica, New York bus station. But there were dream poems, and there were poems of questioning because of Neruda, and there were poems about work. And there was one member of the workshop went back to Mexico for a couple of weeks and missed workshop. And I wondered whether or not, he came back to workshop, and I had given everybody marble notebooks at the beginning of the workshop to kind of jot their thoughts down. And when he came back, I said, did you think or write at all about, and do any poetry while you were gone? And he pulled out his notebook, and he had met someone he had been in love with before in the past. And he had this like 4-page long poem that he had written to her, right? And it was yet another use of poetry within this kind of scenario that we had created, right? By doing a workshop, not at the university, not even at a public library, but directly in the worker center, right? And there were organizers from the worker center there. So if someone talked about an issue that was really terrible in the workshop, if you do that in a regular workshop, you'll kind of evoke empathy from people, right, who are in the workshop, like, that's a terrible thing you went through, et cetera, et cetera. But at the Worker Writer School, we want to say, well, that's terrible, but here's an organizer, and here's an organization that can connect you to your workplace rights, and here are next steps you can take, and let's read this poem at a big event in the farmer's market, et cetera, et cetera. We want that kind of scenario for the kind of public productions of the workshop.
Right. And it definitely had me thinking, because I've used Neruda's Book of Questions in almost every workshop I've taught, even with little kids, because of that possibility to open up the speculative, right? Because once you start to speculate, you do start to think, well, how do you answer that question? How do you create the solution to a problem? So I think that's why we're seeing such a big uptick in the interest in science fiction, because it's doing the same kind of work, right? And we're seeing a lot of writers who've been kind of on the literary spectrum, like a Victor Laval, taking up the mantle and being like, I've always been a science fiction fan. So to me, it's always been really important to think about that. And I kept thinking about that intersection, particularly with the Borders unionizing that you talked about in the early 2000s, and how that fed into Occupy Wall Street. It's like, if there were no unions in this particular business entity that at the time was all over the country, including downtown Chicago, it's like, how do you start to imagine what's next? Let's say you get the union, then how does everything change, right? And we know how it turned out, where is Borders now? But for the people who moved forward from that, you talk extensively about Holly Craig, I believe that's her last name, I don't want to get it wrong. But now she's been organizing here in Chicago, and I'm sure that was part of her experience too. And I believe other people who've moved forward from that are still thinking about the seed that was planted then. And it's very much like, I love the story about the taxi driver who it was the story about his poem. He wrote this one poem about, was it in Chicago? No, the taxi drivers were in New York. But there was one particular dude who wrote this poem, and I think you caught up with him 5 years later.
Oh yeah, that was from
You know
Chicago.
what I'm talking about? Okay,
Yeah,
so
so
I
that
didn't
was
get it wrong.
no, it was in that first workshop in Chicago. His name's
Yeah,
Frank Cunningham. Maybe he's even watching. Hi, Frank, if you are.
I
But
love your
Frank was in
poem,
the first
Frank.
Chicago. In the first Chicago workshop, he was a longtime member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and we had read Tilly Olson's poem, "I Want You Women Up North to Know," which is this great long poem that she takes a letter and talks about. It's basically about the working conditions of factory workers and the Texas-Mexico border textile factories. And it's a poem about the working conditions there. And so I was like, well, let's, using that poem, write about like our working worlds. And but we can go two ways, right? We can go what's most difficult about our working lives, or we could say what we're most proud of in our working lives. Because I think in the history of working class literature, it's a lot of the worst, right? But as getting back to your dreaming question, it's like, of course, there are things in our working lives that we're incredibly proud of as well. So Frank had been a person who, around Chicago, had worked on the tops of buildings installing electrical fixtures and lighting. And the poem is basically about him like driving through Chicago, looking up at the buildings and knowing the work that he did. You know, like, I worked on that light, I put the lights up on that tower, I did this, I did that. And like, how great it is to kind of document that. And so we did a performance. Actually, Holly from the bookstore was at that performance in Chicago when we did it, and Frank invited his family out. And it was so, and this happens pretty regularly in the workshop. It's really beautiful that, you know, you see your parent in a certain light. Like, my mom has been a domestic worker her whole life, or my dad has been an electrician his whole life. And here he is on a stage reading and performing this poem. And it's a completely different picture that you hadn't realized in that person before. And people are always like, I didn't know that my kids could see me in that way. Like, I love my job as an electrician. I've done it my whole life. I've put my kids through college, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a different part of me that had been in there and I hadn't let out before. And there's a great part about that Frank story that I hadn't talked with him for a bunch of years, and then I came back to Chicago to do something at the art museum at Northwestern. They had put on a show of like 1930s, 1940s proletarian art, and they asked me to come do a reading and talk, and I asked Frank to read with me. So Frank came and read at the museum, and we went out to dinner afterwards. And he told me, this was a little bit before that he had kind of forgotten about that poem, and he was on vacation with his wife in Key West, and he was waiting for her in the lobby, and there was a copy of the Saturday Evening Post magazine like on the table, and he said they had a poetry contest in the Saturday Evening Post, and he was like, oh, I remember I wrote that poem about the lights in Chicago. I should enter it in this poetry contest, the Robert Frost poetry contest. And so he entered it in the Saturday Evening Post contest, and he came in third place, and they published his poem in the Saturday Evening Post from the workshop, which was like this, incredibly beautiful thing that the poem had kind of stayed with him for so long, and that he could be, in the Florida Keys, like kicking back, sitting you can picture the hotel lobby, and he's like, oh, Saturday Evening Post poetry contest. I'm going to take down this information and send my poem in. So it's these sort of beautiful moments that happen when we take poetry, out into the world in the way that I try to talk about in the book.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason why this book really wasn't just intellectually engaging for me, but it touched my heartstrings in a lot of ways, because as a teacher, you don't always get to see those moments, right? Like years and years later, because they had that moment with you and with other writers in their community, what they do independently, right? Or even just kind of a similar moment that I had was, and you kind of show moments like this throughout the book too, where people in the workshop start to reach out to each other, or you get to be like, oh, you're trying to find this person, so really you're just kind of moderating or facilitating, and they kind of take charge in this way where it's like, well, we want to organize this event. Can such and such come and read a poem? And they start to do it for themselves, you know? And I think that's really important too. Hi, young peoples. Hi, lovely. But I guess I'm kind of wondering, do you kind of, as somebody who's taught in a bunch of different places, are there things that you feel like you've done to encourage that? Do you hope this book could be a blueprint for people who want to do that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm always wary of blueprints because I feel like they kind of standardize things. Mm-hmm. And a couple of things I just say about these kind of workshops, and people have done great versions of them as I try to talk about in those early chapters. But for me and social poetics, there's a couple of, in the Worker Writer School workshops, there's a couple of key things, right? One of them, I think, for me, that's been really important and stays really important is duration, right? A lot of times the poetry workshop is set up as like, okay, we're going to meet 4 weeks at this place and we're going to write some poems and then that's it, right? Mm-hmm. Or we're going to meet once a month for a couple of months and that's our workshop. Or again, every week for, 2 months or 3 months, right? And so we've been doing it for 9 years, right? The start of our 10th year, we have members of Domestic Workers United. One of the lead organizers, Christine Lewis, has been in the Worker Writer School Poetry Workshop this is her 10th year. She's been coming every year for 10 years. She should have a, MFA, PhD in creative writing point in time. And, she's read everybody. She's read everybody, studied everybody, written incredible poems about that. But that there can be a place to come back to, right? Because, I'm coming out of the Ford factory, or I'm a street vendor in New York City, or I work the MTA subway booth in Manhattan, and I have these ideas to write things down. I can't always have to be looking for a place to do it. There's not time. Like, this is first Saturday of every month at 588 Broadway in now on Zoom. We meet, we're there each and every week. So that duration is part of it. And I think that the part I told before about we can't have workshops where all we produce is empathy, right? And this gets back to Daniel's kind of opening about the sort of neoliberal turn, right? It can't just be like, oh, this is a terrible thing that happened to you. Change the line break in the fourth line, and I'm not sure that slant rhyme in the second stanza is working, et cetera, right? So for us, we're not an open workshop to all workers, and I've organized it in that way in particular. We're a collaborative organization with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, with Domestic Workers United, with the Street Vendor Project, with the Retail Action Project. Because if people come into the workshop and produce a poem where people are like, you're being taken advantage of in your job, we need to be able to say, here's an organization, here's a member of that group, here's an organizer for that in that field that you can talk to and find out what you can do. And so that, to me, is one of the really key things that distinguishes what we do in the Worker Writer School from the typical creative writing workshop.
Right. And were you going to say something, Daniel? Go ahead.
No, thank you. Sure. So, I wanted to jump in on a couple things, but so I had a few themes that I wanted to ask you about. And one, you're sort of talking about there, about the sort of tangible, the tangible results that come out of some of the poems that were written. And I was thinking in particular about the story of the New York City cab drivers that you tell. That seemed to me to be one of the most moving stories in the book. To contextualize it a bit, and then I'll turn it back over to you. They are struggling as a result of the new gig economy, Uber and Lyft and things like that, as a result of a lack of protective policies. They are working 120 hours a week, and you tell the stories of some who end up committing suicide, right? And then you shift the focus to Seth Goldman, I believe Seth is his name, right? Mm-hmm. And a poem that he writes. And one of the things I want to kind of shift to later is talking about your sort of close readings of the poems, which I think are great. And he reads this poem at a rally for the workers, and And then there is a policy change that happens after that. And you imply that there is a direct link between those two things. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of maybe talk about that story about the New York City cab drivers a little more, but as well, maybe talk about some of the ways in which the poems and the poets that you write about are that how their work as poets is resulting in tangible changes in their lives as workers.
Sure. Well, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance to me is, again, one of the most phenomenal worker centers out there, right? They've been organizing taxi drivers for many, many years. They have their union meetings happen at, I think, 2 a.m. in the morning, right, when workers are changing shifts. But they're, when we were in New York, one of the things that really affected me a lot was when Trump issued his Muslim ban, and the New York taxi workers sent out everybody to boycott, all the drivers to boycott going to JFK Airport. And they did it. And they themselves literally shut down JFK's international terminal as people were out protesting. It was a ghost town. There's a picture of the tweet and the terminal in the book. And so they had organized. So, the taxi industry has been really, really hurt in New York City by the gig economy workers, Uber, and others. And so they put together a 30-day protest against the New York City government and to put caps on Uber and Lyft so that there could only be so many Uber and Lyft drivers in the city, and taxi workers would stand a chance. The price of their medallions, which were incredibly expensive, had sunk through the floor. They were working, as you said, 120 hours a week and making nothing. They couldn't pay for their mortgages, their food, etc. There had been a string of driver suicides. And so the New York taxi workers, they were had an outdoor protest at the house of the head of Uber, right? They had one at Lyft headquarters. They had a letter writing campaign. They had a petition that was signed by so many people. They did a driver slowed down in the streets. They did all of these things over the course of 30 days. And it was culminating in the day before the New York City Council vote. And they had a huge protest outside of City Hall in New York City. One of the drivers whose brother had killed himself, a taxi driver, his brother came and spoke. As you mentioned, Seth Goldman read a poem. The head of the Taxi Workers Alliance called me really early in the morning and was like, can Seth come and read his poem at this performance? And so Seth read his poem, a couple other drivers spoke, and it ended up that the New York City Council passed a law to put it was the first city in the United States to put caps on rideshare drivers. And so what was most interesting to me about that, a couple of things. One was that the Worker Center, the Taxi Workers Alliance, reached out to us to have a poet from our group come and read a poem at the event, which I thought was great, to have an opportunity to do that, right? But more so, what was really interesting to me, I think, in that whole event was that typically when that happens, an organization will reach out to a poet, right? Someone who's not a taxi driver, and have them come in and do a performance, right? And so the thing that I'm trying to illustrate, I think, in that part is that we're trying to build within organizations the capacity for people to become who they are as poets and performers, and to be able to perform at those events and at those things. Certainly when auto workers were organizing, the drum and other groups in Detroit in the 1960s, there were certainly people who were performers. The Detroit Do I Mind Dying has poems in it. It was the basis of Motown. People were playing in bands and doing all kinds of things when they weren't working in the Cadillac plant or the Buick plant, et cetera, et cetera. But how do we create institutions for people who are within organizations to become spokespeople, cultural spokespeople from the position that they're working and writing from? And so that's what I was trying to get across in that part of the story.
Can I ask one more question? So one of my favorite things about the book, as I was mentioning, how Tara mentioned, right? It is in many ways a book of literary criticism and a book of literary history, right? And one of my favorite things is how seriously you take the poems written by the workers, right? And in doing this, it seems to me you're making an argument, right? On the one hand, against the kind of imperialization of poetry canons, also against the kind of confinement of poetry to upper echelons. But I think more importantly, you're saying that the poets that the workers are the poems that the workers are making are groundbreaking, right? And you do this multiple times. So you talk about Alondo McIntyre, the Jamaican restaurant worker in New York City, who does indeed write a brilliant poem in multiple dialects, both about his own experience, connecting it to global issues. It really is brilliant. And you say aptly that he's imagining a radical new role, new formations, and new futures for the poetry workshop. And then you mentioned Christine Lewis, the domestic worker, and you have a long section about the pantoum, which is great. And you say that the poems that she and other domestic workers are writing are, you say, poems written by migrant or refugee workers whose primary occupations are neither poetry nor academia might be bolder, more imaginatively militant examples than those in the canon. And then earlier in the book, you talk about the Federation of South African Trade Unionists, and you say that one of their poets, that they are creating a militant new form of poetry, right? So amid all of these very poignant stories about workers and economic history and economic rights and the ways in which workers are both struggling and oppressed and overcoming it, I think you're making a series of aesthetic claims about the poems that you study. And I maybe just wonder if you could talk about that, about what you think what you think about the aesthetics of the poems that you were talking about and how you kind of came to writing about them in that way.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Certainly one of them is, the book is really grounded in the work of like the Birmingham Cultural Studies, right? The Birmingham School and Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall and others. And the attempt to kind of critically read cultural production that isn't necessarily at the top of people's pyramid, right? Like, can we look at a dime store novel and really analyze it in a particular way? Can we look at the music coming out of, parts of the UK in the 1970s and analyze it with the eye that we would bring to anything? So that whole school of criticism was really significant to me. But I think simultaneously that, if we are within a kind of capitalist system now that pushes everything up kind of toward the top of the pyramid, right? We have like people in undergrad workshops, people in MFA workshops, people who have books, people whose books win awards, people who win bigger awards, Pulitzer, whatever, right? As we kind of scale it to go up, like we as poets are participating in the system that we're critiquing, that we say that we're against. So what if instead of that, one of the things that was really the most influential to me, like I've been doing poetry in the schools, poetry in the prisons since 89, I think, something like that, 1989. When I was in grad school, I took a class where basically they said, here's 5th grade at the local school, go at it, right? And it was great. Like I loved doing that. But I went, my wife and I went to Argentina after the economic collapse, and we visited a lot of the factories that had been taken over by workers and run under worker control. And in one of them that I talk about in the book, IMPA, which produced it was an aluminum factory, and so they produced like tubes for toothpaste and paint and other kind of products. The factory had closed, the boss had hit the road, probably left town, left the country. But the workers said, no, we're going to take it over and we're going to run it under our control. We know how to do it, right? And they started producing. And, lots of things happen, police, National Guard, et cetera, try to kick them out. But cultural groups from the community came to protect the factory. Like they stood watch outside the gates. They were there. They brought food, et cetera, et cetera. And so when IMPA started producing again under worker control, and say they were at, 60, 70% of their original capacity, they said, well, it's this big factory, right? Like this huge aluminum factory. And they were like, well, you who supported us, here are some open spaces in the factory. Why don't you come inside and have your, dance classes here? Why don't you put a kiln here and have pottery classes for the workers? Here's a people's lending library. Let's put that up and workers can take a book after work and bring it back. Here's a studio where we could do yoga or poetry workshops or whatever. Like it was this way in which this kind of what's called horizontalism, right, when I talk about in the book, that this horizontal structure had been kind of created for workers to participate in culture, right? It had built an institution within itself for workers to be able to say, okay, I'm done with my 9 or 8 or 10 hour shift on the tube. I'm going to take a yoga class and then take a book home for the weekend, right? Like how amazing was that? And the other thing I remember is that when my wife and I first walked in, there was a guy who greeted us and he said, I said his name and he said, I'm one of the original workers and, I'm one of the most senior workers here at the plant. And here comes a new person, he pointed, and he's coming in for a job interview. And if we hire him, he and I will make the same salary. We will continue to work at the same salary for our lives because we want that kind of equality, right? And so it felt to me that as someone who had been trained in a kind of, trained myself really, in a kind of literary analysis and a kind of cultural studies approach, I was like, well, what if we look at these anthologies? There's thousands of them, right? For 50 years, we've had state poets in the schools programs, right? Anthologies are like 50 from every state, probably. We have all these, like the June Jordan workshops, other ones by people, in a high school in New Jersey that produce these incredible poems. I have a stack of them here that I ended up editing out of the book that have these poems that let's read them and let's see what they tell us about society at that point in time. We could go and look at, Robert Lowell's poem, right? But we could also go and look at what did a fourth grader in a public school in New Jersey think at that time. And then let's not pit them even against each other, let's look at them both, right? So I felt that all this other literary work at the top of the canon had gotten all of this attention and all of this work. And this other stuff was completely anonymous, right? I have a stack next to me right here of incredible anthologies from prisons in the 60s and 70s that have been, the word stamped on it is weeded, right? They have been weeded out of the public library, right? Out of libraries in Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago and everywhere, right? And so you can't tell me that in this day and age, when we're having the kind of conversations we're having about police brutality, the prison system, abolition, et cetera, that these anthologies are not vital, right? What were people thinking in 1968 in Soledad? What were they writing about in 1972, right after the Attica uprising? How were they people's historians who could retell in poetry what had happened in that moment?
Right. I think, and not even just in that moment, right? Like, I find myself being in conversation with people a lot when they've never written at all, and they go, oh, I don't know if I can do this. I'm not a writer. And I'm sure you've heard that a lot too, Mark. And I could say nobody can do you, though, right? Nobody's going to be able to tell me, like, let's say it is a fourth grader. I know what it was like to be a fourth grader in but I have no idea what it's like to be a fourth grader in Chicago in 2020. And I can't tell who that individual person is, right? I don't know what it means. Like, I remember looking at Frank's poem and just even the construction terms. The way I've heard some construction workers or people who understand how to do that work, the eloquence that they bring to it, the terminology, and how they make it clear to somebody like me who has no idea what that is. and they do it in a poem or in an essay, it's powerful. And I think we're in a culture that undermines people's expertise and favors other levels of expertise over others, right? And I think this book puts them all on the same playing field. Like those voices all matter because they all touch us in different ways.
Yeah, and these are the poets who inspire us, right? I mean, so like
Right.
in our workshop, we're reading Ernesto Cardenal, we're reading Mahmoud Darwish, we're reading and read with last year Sonia Sanchez, right? Like we did, maybe I'll end with this, and if there's a couple of questions we coming in, we could take a look at it. But you know, when coronavirus hit, we had at the Worker Writers School done this like 7-month study of the haiku, right? We started out in like October. And Hiroaki Sato, who has this book from New Directions called On Haiku, he came and did a workshop for us on a program with like Ruthie Gilmore and Bill Ayers and others, right? So we were doing political conversations, prison conversations, poetry conversations, etc. Then for the next, 5-6 months, we looked at, the haiku of classical Japanese, Basho, Busan, others. But we also looked at Japanese American internment camp haiku. We looked at Sonia Sanchez haiku. We looked at haiku from the Attica prison anthology that came out in '74. We looked at Amiri Baraka's Loku, C-O-U-P, right? And his kind of chapbooks of those. We looked at all that stuff. And then on the first Saturday in March, we met at Penn, and that was like the moment where people were starting to speak the word coronavirus, right? First couple days of March. And we always, we've been together, a lot of us, for so long. That's usually like a big family of hugging and a table of food, and et cetera, for our workshops. And this time I stood at the door at Penn's office with a big bottle of hand sanitizer and gave a pump of hand sanitizer to everybody when they came in. And then we went to the back room, and I had realized I'm walking in to Penn that day that coronavirus had 5 syllables, right? And so this was I said, well, what if we wrote coronavirus haiku? And we started writing them that day. Everybody left. And then, of course, between, the month of March is when everybody's world kind of turned upside down. We all went into our houses and we started workshopping on Zoom, and people wanted to continue. So we met for many months, March, April, May, June, July. We met twice a month and wrote haiku and continued to produce them. And people, here are people who have been working these jobs forever, who have been told anybody can do this job, right? Anybody can work at a restaurant, fast food counter. Anybody can punch a button at the subway or sell food on a street in New York City or work in a restaurant, right? Fast food restaurant. And now we discover in March and April and May that these are quote unquote essential workers, right? That these are basically people who are keeping us alive by stocking grocery shelves, right? By working in food processing plants, right? Who allow us a moment of respite because we can go pick up some food instead of cooking it ourselves for the 21st consecutive time that week. And so what does it mean for people who are essential workers, frontline workers, how to process that? And haiku became the space to do it, but it was a haiku that was developed through a kind of long craft tradition, right? We read with Sonia Sanchez. The guy who wrote the book on haiku for New Directions came and gave a lecture and workshop with us. We deeply embedded in that craft while still being able to tell the stories. And I think that's the importance of that. It needs to go on. It can't just be a 4-week, once a week, 4 Saturdays, and then see you later, right? And we need to build these alternative spaces and institutions and provide an opportunity for people to do it. And I'll just end the story by saying that, the people got really excited about this, and a bunch of articles came out, and the workers' haiku were a cover story on the Albany Times Union newspaper. And I was like, when was the last time in the United States that poetry of any kind whatsoever made the front page of a major city's newspaper? I mean, I don't know, maybe in the WPA era or something it happened, but it doesn't really happen. And here on the front page were haiku, an interview with, a member from Domestic Workers United, Taxi Workers Alliance, and these other groups. And so it's been really inspirational to to continue this and try to create a kind of space like this for a new kind of worker writing.
It's exciting work, and I really look forward to hearing more about it, seeing more about it, and I wish we had more time where you could like read a section of the book, but do we have time, Mandy? Maybe would you like to share a poem from the book to close us out, or did you want to do questions? It's your show.
I'd like to hear if there are questions. I'm happy to hear questions. I try not to read the poems really because I try to. We have opportunities where a lot of spaces and forums where the workers in the school have been reading their poems, and so we're just trying to create kind of more of those. There's one coming up in October. We just did one a little while ago with Aja Monet's homemade series and some other stuff like that. So, but I'd love to hear a couple of questions.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to share that we have a call for Cold Mountain Elementary to come back into print, which I second that call.
Can I just say, end of September, it'll be back in print.
Oh, that's great news! Well, you'll have to come back and do an event to celebrate the back in print, Cold Mountain Elementary, and we can all be together. Oh, that's great news. We do have a couple questions. Someone says this may be in the book, which I'm looking forward to reading, but are these workshops multilingual? And in the history of these types of workshops, are they multilingual?
Yeah, they have been in the past. So I've done them in Panama, with a group called the Indonesian Migrant Workers Union in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam and The Hague. And so that was a process of working with the organizers, setting up translators for the workshops, and then being able to do the workshops and performances. We also did a couple-day one at there was a poetry festival in the UK called Poetry and Revolution that they had asked me to come and do a reading, and I asked instead, because I've been working at that point with Domestic Workers United. I said, would it be possible to do a workshop with this group there, Justice for Domestic Workers, now called Voice of the Domestic Worker. They changed their name. And so for 2 days, we met at their union office, did workshops. They had translators, like 3 or 4 different languages at that workshop. And then we ended so at the conference then, I did a little short introduction, and I showed a video of the Ford workers in the U.S. and South Africa reading their poems, which I talk about in the book. And then the group of domestic workers came up and read this collaborative poem that they had all written together. It was a beautiful experience. It felt like, if we're in the academy talking about poetry and revolution, how beautiful to be able to do it by having migrant domestic workers from all these different countries around the world come and do this group poem together to kind of capstone the event. So it was a really beautiful moment, and we've done some other stuff with them since then as well.
Mark, would you just to add on to that question, would you just say a few words about what you call transnational poetry dialogues? You started to talk about it, but I think it seems to be a really important part of the book.
Yeah, so I had an opportunity after I had started doing the workshops at the Ford plant to go to South Africa. My previous book, Shut Up, Shut Down, had come out, and I wanted to do some research at this library, that National English Literary Museum in South Africa. And so I wrote a grant, and surprisingly, it was like the first grant I ever got. It was a travel grant. And so my wife and I went to South Africa, and I had said, I didn't know, this was early days of the internet, like Netscape days or something like that. And so I just looked on the internet, and I found a union, because I knew there were auto plants, Ford plants in particular, in South Africa. And I just emailed, and I'd had so much, as I say in the book, like so many attempts to do this in the past that didn't work out. And so I sent the email, and like 2 days later, I got an email back from the publicity person at the union, NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. And they were like, Comrade Nowak, we would love to have you do workshops. We would have 8-hour-a-day workshops, 2 days a week, first in Port Elizabeth and then in Pretoria. Are you a vegetarian for the catered meals? Here's the cell number of your driver from our union who will pick you up at your hotel and take you back, et cetera, et cetera. It's funny now, but it was like, because South Africa in the apartheid struggle had cultural workers and industrial workers had been so deeply connected in that struggle that this was just something that happened for decades in South Africa. This was not some new idea. They were like, oh, this is great. So what ended up happening is I took a video of the Ford workers reading their poems in front of the plant in St. Paul, took them to South Africa, did workshops there where I showed the videos and showed their poems, gave copies of their poems, and they wrote poems back to their workers their fellow workers in St. Paul. And then in St. Paul, we had an event where we played I had videotaped the South African workers reading their poems too. And we had an event inside the auditorium of the Ford plant where the workers from St. Paul read, the video was played to the South African workers. And what was great about it is that, typically what happens is like if a plant like Ford closes, workers blame internationally. Right? They're like, the Chinese are stealing our jobs. They're going to Ford plants in India. It's so much cheaper to produce Ford cars in South Africa, right? And it's so like racism, everything gets produced by this decision of the bosses of capital. But instead, what we found out in these is that, when we got to South Africa, the workers in South Africa thought, oh, American Ford workers, they have just huge houses and gold paved driveways, and they thought the worker was treated like a king basically in the United States, and that wasn't true at all. And similarly, when we came back, all the workers at the Ford plant were like, we've been blaming workers overseas for taking our jobs, and they're facing the exact same kind of retrenchment, job loss issues that we're facing here. So what happens is that, Ford managers always get together in, the annual Ford meeting, and the managers of plants all come together at some super swank hotel and, have a bunch of PowerPoints and stuff like that. But workers never have a chance to talk, right? Workers from the US had never seen a Ford worker in any other country in the world. Workers in South Africa had never seen an American Ford worker. But when I played the videotape, they knew of one, right? Denny Dickhausen, who had worked 35 years in the plant, was losing his job. His daughter worked in the plant. She was losing her job. And what was she going to do? Her daughter was 32 years old, had a job that maybe paid $30 an hour at the UAW, and was now going to have to, I put down in the book, the other best paying jobs in the Twin Cities at that point, they were about $5 an hour, right? And so I'm really interested, and this right here, Skype and Zoom and these other technologies are, I think, a possibility to explore for doing this kind of work more. Like, why not invite to our workshops, as we have been, like other workers in the same sector who are based elsewhere? We've had, even in the Zooms we've had since COVID, we had, for example, a member of Domestic Workers United who moved back to Trinidad to take care of her mother, and she now Zooms in from Trinidad and is able to rejoin the workshop. So there's, I think, a ton of possibilities around that I think I just touch on a little bit in the book, and I'd love to explore deeper, and I hope to explore deeper in the time to come.
Great. Well, we have a question I would love to end on, and then also, Daniel, I don't want to forget to give a shout out to your event. So after this, remind me if I do. Someone asked, when you read Neruda's book of questions with farm workers and were asked, likely, what is a poem? What was your answer? And if you weren't asked that, I would like to know what your answer is.
Yeah, so I wasn't asked that, right? Because like a tradition of poetry is very strong, and it's usually much stronger in workers anywhere except the United States, right? And so that this was not some weird thing. Like, it was no surprise that Antonio took his notebook back and wrote a 3 or 4 page poem when he came back. And so, I don't know really how, like, I have these little phrases that I always think of when people ask what a poem is. And I move away from that because I think that word sometimes frightens people away, right? And so one of the words I turn to is, early in the book, I talk about Meridel Lesueur, the great Minnesota, like WPA era writer. And she said she had this pamphlet called Worker Writers. And she encouraged everybody. It was like a pamphlet of how to write a story, and here's an analysis of the story, and we're going to hand it out at workplaces. And I'm like, what an incredible publication that would be now, right? Like for poetry, like here are some poems, here, let's analyze them, and here's how you write them, and here's some prompts, and let's put them on a little piece of paper or a little chapbook and hand them out at workplaces. But so she always said that she used the word chroniclers very often, right? To how do you chronicle your own life? And I tell a story about Denny, the Ford worker, who used to keep little notepads in his pocket at work and jot down, like somebody said something funny, something he noticed on the job, something he wanted to remember. And he kept them and never knew what to do with them until he saw in the UAW newsletter an advertisement for my poetry workshop. He's like, oh, maybe this is it, and maybe I can go do something now. And then C.L.R. James and Grace Lee Boggs, in a group, in a book that they did called Facing Reality, always use this phrase, recognize and record. And I love this statement, right? Because, like, what do you see? Put it down, and then let's think about it, right? What does it mean, right? And we can then build in language of, like, this is a couplet, right? This is a stanza if we don't know, right? We can move from that direction. But the first thing is to recognize and record, right? To see what's happening in your life, to put a pen or pencil or in notes on your phone or whatever, put that information down, and then let's create a space where you can come and we can develop that. We can analyze it. We can do political analysis. We can do aesthetic analysis, and we can build here. But here's a tradition of poets, both those who are in the big, thick anthologies and others who have one chapbook out but have done amazing things, right? Worker poems that we have from the 1930s or from anthologies from China, etc., that I talk about in the book. Like, all of this is this is how we build power. This is how we build solidarity. This is how we build something different from what we're in now. And that's really what I'm pushing for in the book.
That's great. And I see in the chat that maybe you and Chris Fishbach are in talks to create that poetry pamphlet.
Oh, it may be possible.
Fingers crossed. Well, thank you all three. I'm going to put you all three on the screen. Thank you all three for joining us tonight. And Daniel, do you want to talk a little bit about the upcoming event? I can make sure to shout it out in the chat.
Oh, sure. If you can share the link, that would be great. If you are free out there in internet land on Sunday, I work with Kenning Editions, a small press out of Chicago, published by Patrick Durgan now for many, many years. And we just published a book by the Cuban poet Legna Rodriguez. Legna's a young poet who's had several books in English now over the last few years. And she will be reading her own work, and she will be reading with Ureyoan Noel, a great poet, translator, multilingualist, performer, and that will be at 3:00 on Sunday Central Time to launch Legna's terrific new book. So if you could share the link, that would be great.
Yeah, it's in the chat. Everyone check it out. And final thoughts, anyone, before we tell everyone goodbye?
I just want to give one last shout out to Tara's Whirlwind Center. And the link, I think, is in the chat already. If we're really talking about building alternative spaces, like, here it is in action. So if you can throw some dollars that way, it would be greatly appreciated. I think it's a super inspirational idea and project, and I encourage people to take a look at that.
Thank you, Mark. And this is what the book looks like. If you have not picked it up yet, definitely pick it up and read it. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone, and I hope to see you all in person or on Zoom soon. Good night.
Likewise. Take care. Be safe,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you,